There is a certain kind of tragedy that only science can deliver, a slow and quiet reckoning that comes not from ignorance, but from too much curiosity, too much devotion, and too much courage in the face of the unknown. Throughout history, brilliant men and women have peered into the darkest corners of the natural world and pulled back secrets that changed everything. Secrets about radiation, about the atom, about the invisible poisons that surround us. And in return for those discoveries, the universe took their lives. These are the stories of scientists who were killed by the very things they uncovered. In the late 1700s, in the cold, lamp-lit back rooms of Swedish apothecary shops, a quiet and unassuming man named Carl Wilhelm Scheele was conducting experiments that would reshape the entire field of chemistry. He was born in 1742 in Stralsund, a small Baltic port city perched on the windswept coast of the Baltic Sea that at the time sat under Swedish rule. And he came from humble beginnings, the son of a brewer and grain merchant who never found much financial success. The family was large and money was scarce, and there was no expectation that young Carl would grow up to be anything other than a tradesman. At just 14 years old, he was sent off to work as a pharmacist's apprentice in Gothenburg, a bustling port city where ships from across Europe docked daily. And it was there, surrounded by shelves of glass bottles filled with strange powders, crystalline salts, and peculiar liquids that seemed to shimmer in the low light, that something awoke inside of him. Night after night, after the shop had closed and his employer had gone to bed, Carl stayed behind, mixing chemicals by candlelight, inhaling fumes, heating substances over open flames, and watching what happened. He devoured every chemistry text he could get his hands on, poring over the works of Georg Ernst Stahl and other early theorists, teaching himself the language of elements and reactions in an era when that language was still being invented. The story goes that one evening, Scheele mixed a particularly volatile combination that produced an explosion loud enough to shake the house, sending his employer into a rage. But even being scolded or reprimanded could not dampen Carl's hunger. He was teaching himself chemistry at a time when the field barely existed as we know it today, and he was doing it with nothing more than raw curiosity and a dangerous lack of fear. Over the next 2 decades, Scheele bounced between pharmacies across Sweden, quietly compiling one of the most extraordinary resumes in the history of science. He discovered oxygen, although he never received proper credit for it because he was painfully slow to publish his findings. And by the time his book finally went to print in 1777, both Joseph Priestley and Antoine Lavoisier had already beaten him to the announcement. He also identified the elements barium, manganese, molybdenum, tungsten, and chlorine, though in many of those cases as well, other scientists received the recognition for isolating or naming them. Scheele discovered citric acid, lactic acid, glycerol, and tartaric acid. He produced hydrogen fluoride, one of the most corrosive substances known to exist, and hydrogen cyanide, one of the most lethal poisons on Earth. He isolated arsenic acid and experimented extensively with compounds of lead and mercury. And through all of this, decade after decade, Scheele had one habit that would ultimately seal his fate. He tasted everything. It sounds almost absurd by modern standards, but in the 18th century, there were very few reliable methods of chemical characterization. Scientists could not run mass spectrometry or gas chromatography. They could not peer into molecular structures with electron microscopes. So instead, they relied on their own senses, smell, color, texture, and yes, taste, to try and identify and classify the substances they encountered. Scheele took this practice further than almost anyone else. He routinely put samples of his discoveries to his lips, rolling them across his tongue, noting whether they were bitter or sweet, sharp or metallic. This included compounds of arsenic. It included mercury. It included lead. It included hydrogen cyanide, a gas so deadly that a single deep breath of concentrated fumes can kill a human being in minutes. Scheele not only inhaled it, but described its flavor in his notes, calling it a distinctive bitter almond taste. It is almost incomprehensible that he survived as long as he did. But the human body can only absorb so much punishment before it begins to fail, and by 1785, the cumulative damage of a lifetime spent handling, inhaling, and consuming some of the most toxic substances on Earth finally caught up with him. At just 42, Scheele developed symptoms of severe kidney disease and a painful, disfiguring skin condition that was almost certainly a manifestation of chronic heavy metal poisoning. His hands, the very tools with which he had conducted every experiment, were ravaged. His energy drained. His body, having been fed a slow diet of poison for nearly 3 decades, was shutting down. In his final days, knowing the end was near, Scheele made one last practical decision. He married the widow of the pharmacist who had previously owned his shop, not out of love in the traditional sense, but so that she could legally inherit the pharmacy and his possessions. 2 days after the wedding, on May 21st, 1786, Carl Wilhelm Scheele was dead at the age of 43. The official cause was listed as mercury poisoning. He had spent his entire adult life discovering the building blocks of modern chemistry, and those very building blocks, absorbed drop by drop and breath by breath, had slowly and methodically destroyed him from the inside out. Just a few years after Scheele's quiet death in a small Swedish town, another giant of chemistry was facing a very different kind of end across the continent. Antoine Lavoisier, born in Paris in 1743 to a wealthy and well-connected family, was in many ways the opposite of Scheele. Where Scheele toiled in anonymity in the back rooms of pharmacies, Lavoisier moved through the glittering salons of Parisian high society, rubbing shoulders with intellectuals, politicians, and aristocrats. He was the son of an attorney at the Parliament of Paris, and when his mother died while he was still a boy, he inherited a large fortune that would fund both his scientific work and his lavish lifestyle. He attended the prestigious College Mazarin, where he studied the humanities and sciences before obtaining a law degree, following in the footsteps of his father. But even as he trained in law, his mind was drawn irresistibly toward the natural world. He began attending public lectures on chemistry and physics, working alongside leading naturalists, and conducting his own experiments with a level of precision and rigor that was rare for his time. Lavoisier used his considerable fortune to build some of the finest laboratory equipment in the world, custom-designed instruments that allowed him to measure chemical reactions with unprecedented accuracy. Where Scheele discovered oxygen but failed to understand what it truly was, Lavoisier not only identified the element, but gave it its name and used it to topple the long-standing phlogiston theory that had dominated chemistry for a century. The phlogiston theory held that all combustible materials contained a mysterious, fire-like substance called phlogiston that was released during burning. Lavoisier proved through elegant experiments that combustion was actually a chemical reaction involving oxygen, a revelation that fundamentally changed how scientists understood the physical world. He is widely regarded as the father of modern chemistry, the man who transformed the field from a collection of mystical practices into a rigorous, measurement-based science. He established the law of conservation of mass, proving that matter is neither created nor destroyed in a chemical reaction, only transformed. He helped develop the modern system of chemical nomenclature that scientists still use today. His wife, Marie-Anne Palze, whom he married when she was just 13, played a vital role in his work, translating scientific papers from English, keeping detailed notes on his experiments, and creating intricate illustrations of his laboratory instruments. Together, they were one of the most formidable scientific partnerships in history. His contributions to chemistry were, in a word, foundational. But Lavoisier was not only a scientist, he was also a financier and a public administrator, and it was this dual identity that would cost him everything. Years earlier, he had purchased a share in the Ferme Générale, a private company that collected taxes on behalf of the French monarchy. The arrangement was enormously profitable. The Ferme Générale would advance the government a fixed sum and then collect taxes from the populace, keeping the difference as profit. For Lavoisier, this income stream was what made his laboratory possible, paying for the expensive equipment, the rare chemicals, and the skilled assistance his research demanded. But for the common people of France, the Ferme Générale was a symbol of everything wrong with the old regime, a parasitic institution that grew fat on their suffering while they struggled to feed their families. The tax collectors were hated, feared, and deeply resented. And when the French Revolution swept across the country, beginning in 1789, the Ferme Générale became one of its primary targets. For a time, Lavoisier managed to navigate the shifting political landscape. He served on commissions, advised the new government on matters of public finance, and even helped develop the metric system. He believed, perhaps naively, that his scientific contributions would shield him from the worst of the revolutionary fervor. But the revolution had a way of consuming everyone in its path, and by 1793, the reign of terror was in full swing. Robespierre and his allies were sending thousands to the guillotine, and no title, no accomplishment, and no plea of innocence could guarantee safety. In late 1793, Lavoisier was arrested along with 27 other members of the Ferme Générale. They were charged with tax fraud and with adulterating tobacco with water and other harmful ingredients. Lavoisier had been in the middle of a critical series of experiments on the role of oxygen in human respiration when the police came for him. According to historical accounts, his only request to the Revolutionary Tribunal was a brief delay, enough time to finish his experiments, which he believed were of great importance to the advancement of human knowledge. The response from the court has echoed through centuries as one of the most chilling statements ever directed at a scientist. The exact words are debated by historians, but the sentiment attributed to the presiding judge was blunt and devastating. The Republic has no need of scientists. On May 8, 1794, Lavoisier, his father-in-law, and 26 other former tax collectors were marched to the guillotine and executed in a single afternoon. He was 50 years old. The next day, the great mathematician Joseph-Louis Lagrange is said to have remarked that it took them only an instant to cut off his head, but it may take a century to produce another like it. A year and a half later, the French government quietly exonerated Lavoisier of all charges. A note was sent to his widow. It read simply, "To the widow of Lavoisier, who was falsely convicted." But by then, the damage had been done, and one of the greatest scientific minds in human history had been reduced to ashes by the very nation he had served. While Lavoisier's death came at the hands of political violence, the blade of a state that had turned against its own greatest minds, the next story is about a woman whose passion for a brand new technology quietly consumed her body from the inside out, so gradually that by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was far too late to stop it. In 1895, a German physicist named Wilhelm Röntgen made an accidental discovery in his laboratory in Würzburg that would revolutionize medicine forever. While experimenting with cathode rays, he noticed that a fluorescent screen across the room was glowing, even though it was shielded from the cathode tube. Something invisible was passing through solid objects and illuminating the screen. Röntgen called these mysterious emissions X-rays, the X standing for unknown, and when he used them to create an image of his wife's hand, clearly showing the bones beneath her flesh and the ring on her finger, the scientific world was electrified. Within weeks of Röntgen's announcement, the news had spread across Europe and America. Scientists, doctors, curious amateurs, and even carnival showmen were scrambling to get their hands on X-ray equipment, eager to see what these mysterious rays could do. Some used them to locate broken bones. Others used them as parlor tricks, imaging the skeletons of willing volunteers at public exhibitions. No one, in those early exhilarating months, had any idea that the rays could be dangerous. Among the many people captivated by this new technology was Elizabeth Fleischmann, a young woman living in San Francisco who would become one of the earliest and most skilled practitioners of X-ray photography in the United States, and also one of its first victims. Elizabeth was born in 1867 in El Dorado County, California, the daughter of Jewish immigrants from the Austrian Empire. Her family was not wealthy. Her father worked as a baker and later as a small-time merchant, and financial hardship forced Elizabeth to drop out of high school during her senior year to help support the household. For years, she worked as a bookkeeper, living a quiet and unremarkable life. But everything changed in 1896 when she attended a public lecture on X-ray technology in San Francisco. The demonstration electrified her. Here was something extraordinary, a way to see inside the human body without cutting it open. Elizabeth immediately enrolled in a course of study in electrical science, and upon completing it, borrowed money from her father to purchase her own X-ray apparatus and a fluoroscope. Within a year, she had opened California's first private X-ray laboratory on Sutter Street in San Francisco. What happened next was nothing short of remarkable. Elizabeth threw herself into the work with an intensity that astonished the medical community. She became known for producing X-ray images of stunning clarity, better than almost anyone else in the country. When wounded soldiers began returning from the Spanish-American War, many of them with bullets and shrapnel lodged deep inside their bodies, Elizabeth's laboratory became the go-to destination for physicians who needed to locate the metal before attempting surgery. The Surgeon General of the United States Army himself visited her studio and became a vocal champion of her work. One of her most famous radiographs captured a 7mm Mauser bullet lodged in the brain of a private named John Gretzer, who had been wounded in the Philippines. The image was so precise that surgeons were able to plan their approach around it, and Gretzer survived. But while Elizabeth took care to protect her patients from the radiation burns that were increasingly being observed in the early days of X-ray use, she was far less cautious with herself. The dangers of prolonged radiation exposure were simply not understood at the time. Elizabeth spent hours in her laboratory every day, standing close to the unshielded X-ray tubes, testing the equipment on her own body, adjusting exposures with her bare hands placed directly in the path of the beam. There were no lead aprons, no protective gloves, no safety protocols. By the early 1900s, the damage was becoming visible. Her skin was red and raw. Her hands were covered in painful sores. And then the tumors appeared. In January of 1905, less than a decade after she had opened her laboratory, doctors were forced to amputate Elizabeth's right arm in an attempt to stop the cancer that had taken root there. It did not stop. Within months, the cancer spread to her lungs and the lining of her chest. On August 3, 1905, Elizabeth Fleischmann died at the age of 38, making her the first woman known to have been killed by X-ray radiation. The San Francisco newspapers mourned her passing, noting that she had sacrificed her arm and then her life in the pursuit of her profession. Her gravestone in Salem Cemetery, just outside of the city, carries an inscription she chose herself. It reads simply, "I think I did some good in this world." Elizabeth Fleischmann's story is a heartbreaking illustration of what happens when science races ahead of safety, and no one embodied that tension more fully than the woman who would become the most famous scientist of the 20th century. Marie Curie, born Maria Sklodowska in Warsaw, Poland in 1867, the same year Elizabeth Fleischmann was born, would go on to change the world's understanding of the atom itself. She would discover two new elements, win 2 Nobel Prizes in 2 different scientific fields, and pioneer the use of radiation in medicine. She would also spend decades bathing in the invisible glow of substances so dangerous that her personal belongings remain radioactive to this day, more than 90 years after her death. Marie's early life was defined by loss and determination. Her mother died of tuberculosis when Marie was just 10, and her oldest sister had died of typhus a few years earlier. Despite being an exceptional student, she was barred from attending university in Russian-occupied Poland simply because she was a woman. Undeterred, she worked as a governess for years, saving every cent she could, until she finally had enough to move to Paris in 1891 and enroll at the Sorbonne. There, she studied physics and mathematics, often going without food to afford her textbooks. She graduated at the top of her class and soon after met Pierre Curie, a quiet and brilliant physicist who would become both her husband and her research partner. Together, the Curies embarked on work that would transform our understanding of the physical world. Marie became interested in the strange rays being emitted by uranium, first discovered by Henri Becquerel in 1896. Using meticulous measurements, she determined that the intensity of these rays was proportional to the amount of uranium present, regardless of the compound it was in. This was a profound insight, one that suggested the radiation was coming from inside the atom itself. She coined the term radioactivity to describe this phenomenon. Working with her husband in a cramped, poorly ventilated shed that served as their laboratory, Marie then discovered that a mineral called pitchblende was even more radioactive than pure uranium, which could only mean one thing. There was something else inside it, something unknown. Through years of painstaking labor, grinding, dissolving, filtering, and crystallizing tons of raw pitchblende by hand, the Curies isolated 2 new elements. The first they named polonium, after Marie's beloved homeland. The second they named radium. In 1903, the Curies were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics, along with Becquerel, for their pioneering research on radioactivity. Marie was the first woman ever to receive a Nobel Prize. In 1911, she won a second Nobel, this time in chemistry, for the isolation of radium, making her the first and to this day, only person to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different scientific fields. But the price of these accomplishments was being extracted from her body every single day she worked. Marie and Pierre handled radioactive materials with their bare hands. They carried test tubes of radium in their pockets. They stored glowing samples in their desk drawers, marveling at the faint blue light the substances emitted in the dark. Neither of them understood what the radiation was doing to their cells, their blood, their bones. Both of them were frequently sick, suffering from fatigue, chronic pain, and burns on their hands that refused to heal. Pierre was killed in 1906 when he was struck by a horse-drawn carriage while crossing a rain-slicked street in Paris. His skull fractured instantly. Marie was devastated, but she refused to let grief stop her work. She accepted the chair at the University of Paris that had been created for Pierre, becoming the first woman ever to hold a professorship at the institution. She continued her research and eventually oversaw the Radium Institute, a world-class laboratory built in her honor by the Pasteur Institute and the University of Paris. Her tireless efforts in the following years not only advanced the science of radioactivity, but also laid the groundwork for its medical applications, particularly in the treatment of cancer, which would eventually be known as Curie therapy. Then came the war. When World War I erupted in 1914, Marie Curie recognized immediately that mobile X-ray units could save countless lives on the battlefield by allowing surgeons to locate bullets, shrapnel, and broken bones before operating. She developed these mobile units herself, equipping automobiles with X-ray equipment and generators. These vehicles, which soldiers affectionately nicknamed Petites Curies, were driven directly to the front lines. Marie herself learned to drive so that she could deliver the equipment personally. She trained over 150 women to operate the machines. She and her teenage daughter Irene, who was barely 17 at the time, drove X-ray cars into combat zones, often under fire, performing thousands of examinations on wounded soldiers. Her efforts during the war are estimated to have assisted in the treatment of more than 1 million soldiers, and every hour she spent inside those vehicles, surrounded by unshielded radiation, added another invisible wound to the ones she had been accumulating for decades. By the late 1920s, Marie's health was deteriorating rapidly. Her vision was failing due to cataracts, almost certainly caused by radiation exposure. She underwent 4 eye surgeries, each one offering only temporary relief. The burns on her fingers were becoming unbearably painful, the skin cracked and raw from years of handling radioactive materials without protection. Some days, she was too ill to go to the laboratory, the place that had been her sanctuary for more than 30 years. She pushed on regardless, attending international conferences, serving on committees, and mentoring the next generation of scientists until her body simply could not carry her any further. On July 4th, 1934, at the Saint-Selimo Sanatorium in the French Alps, surrounded by the mountains she had grown to love during her summers in the countryside, Marie Curie died of aplastic anemia, a rare and devastating blood disease in which the bone marrow stops producing enough new blood cells. She was 66 years old. Her body was so contaminated with radium that it had to be placed in a coffin lined with nearly 3 millimeters of lead. Even today, more than 9 decades later, her personal notebooks, her laboratory equipment, her clothing, and even her cookbooks remain so radioactive that they are stored in lead-lined boxes at the National Library of France. Visitors who wish to view them must sign a liability waiver and wear full protective gear. Marie Curie gave the world an understanding of the atom that made modern medicine, energy production, and even space exploration possible. and the atom repaid her by slowly, relentlessly destroying her from within. Perhaps most hauntingly, her daughter Irene, who followed her mother into nuclear physics and won a Nobel Prize of her own, also died of a radiation-related illness, leukemia, in 1956. Around the same time Marie Curie was making her earliest discoveries in Paris, a very different kind of scientist was conducting a very different kind of experiment in Moscow, one born not from a desire to understand the atom, but from a desire to defeat death itself. Alexander Bogdanov was, by any measure, a remarkable man. Born Alexander Malinovsky in 1873 in the town of Sokolka, in what was then the Russian Empire and is now modern-day Poland, he was a physician, a philosopher, an economist, a science fiction writer, and a founding member of the Bolshevik movement alongside Vladimir Lenin. He was, in every sense, a polymath, a man whose mind refused to stay within the boundaries of any single discipline. At the gymnasium in Tula, he had graduated with a gold medal. He went on to study natural science at Moscow University before being expelled for his involvement in revolutionary student activities. Undeterred, he completed a medical degree at the University of Kharkov in 1899. For the next 2 decades, he bounced between revolutionary politics, philosophical writing, and medical research, becoming at one point the second most powerful figure in the Bolshevik faction, second only to Lenin himself. The two eventually had a bitter falling out over questions of philosophy and ideology, and Bogdanov was expelled from the party in 1909. But he never stopped thinking, writing, or pushing the boundaries of what science could achieve. In 1908, Bogdanov published a science fiction novel called Red Star, which depicted a utopian society on Mars where citizens regularly exchanged blood with one another as a means of maintaining health and extending life. It was fiction, but the idea was deeply personal to Bogdanov. He became genuinely convinced that the key to human rejuvenation, and perhaps even immortality, lay in the exchange of blood between individuals. He theorized that transfusing blood from young, healthy people into older or weaker bodies could restore vitality, reverse the effects of aging, and strengthen the immune system. He called this idea physiological collectivism, a concept that fit neatly into his broader Marxist belief that the sharing of resources, even biological ones, could perfect human society. In 1926, with the backing of Joseph Stalin, who was keenly interested in anything that might extend the lives of the aging Bolshevik old guard after the recent deaths and serious illnesses of several Politburo members, Bogdanov founded the world's first institute of blood transfusion in Moscow. It was a proper research facility with an experimental unit, trained staff, and ambitious goals that stretched far beyond what conventional medicine considered possible. For 2 years, Bogdanov experimented on himself, undergoing 11 blood transfusions with various donors, each one a mutual exchange in which he gave as much blood as he received. After each one, he reported feeling younger, more energetic, and more mentally alert. His eyesight improved, he claimed. His hair loss slowed. He looked healthier. Friends and colleagues noted the change, and for a time, Bogdanov's theories seemed to be holding up. Earlier, he had even treated Leonid Krasin, a prominent Bolshevik diplomat who was suffering from anemia, with a blood transfusion that appeared to succeed. Krasin recovered enough to take on a new post as Soviet ambassador to Great Britain, and Bogdanov's reputation as a miracle worker received a significant boost among the party elite. But on March 24, 1928, Bogdanov sat down for his 12th transfusion. This time, his donor was a 21-year-old university student who, unbeknownst to Bogdanov, or perhaps disregarded by him, was suffering from both tuberculosis and malaria. Bogdanov considered himself immune to tuberculosis, a belief that had no scientific basis whatsoever. The two men exchanged blood, as was Bogdanov's preferred method, each receiving the other's blood in a mutual transfusion. Within hours, something went terribly wrong. Bogdanov developed a severe transfusion reaction. His body, flooded with incompatible blood, whether due to an undetected blood type mismatch or the diseases carried by the student's blood, began to break down. His liver swelled, his kidneys failed, his skin turned yellow with jaundice. For the next 2 weeks, Alexander Bogdanov, the man who had sought to conquer death through the very fluid that sustained life, lay dying in the institute he had founded. True to his scientific nature, he continued making detailed observations about his own deteriorating condition until the very end. He died on April 7, 1928, at the age of 54. In a twist that seems almost too poetic to be real, the student whose blood had killed him made a full recovery. Several decades after Bogdanov's death, in the scorching deserts of New Mexico, the world's most dangerous scientific experiment was underway, and it would produce what might be the most terrifying object ever created by human hands. The Manhattan Project, the United States' top-secret effort to build the first nuclear weapons during World War II, had drawn the brightest minds in physics to the remote mesa of Los Alamos. They were young men mostly, physicists and mathematicians, barely into their 20s and 30s, who had been plucked from universities across the country and brought to this isolated plateau to build a weapon that could end the war and, as they all privately understood, potentially end civilization itself. Among the many lethal materials they worked with, none would earn a more sinister reputation than a single sphere of plutonium that came to be known, after it claimed 2 lives in less than a year, as the Demon Core. The core was manufactured in 1945 as part of the third nuclear weapon the United States was preparing to drop on Japan, following the bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th. It weighed about 14 pounds, just over 6 kilograms, and measured roughly 3.5 inches in diameter, small enough to hold in one hand if you were reckless enough to try. It was a subcritical mass of plutonium-gallium alloy, meaning it was not quite enough material to sustain a nuclear chain reaction on its own, but with the addition of the right reflective materials around it, it could be pushed to the very edge of criticality, the point at which neutrons begin multiplying in an unstoppable cascade that releases massive amounts of energy and radiation. Before it earned its ominous nickname, the scientists at Los Alamos simply called the core Rufus. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, before the third bomb could be dropped, the core was kept at Los Alamos for testing. Scientists would use it in what they called criticality experiments, carefully bringing the core closer and closer to a chain reaction in order to measure how it behaved and to understand the precise conditions under which a nuclear explosion could be triggered. They had an informal name for this kind of work, a darkly poetic phrase coined by the physicist Richard Feynman. They called it tickling the dragon's tail. The first person to be bitten was Harry Daghlian, a 24-year-old physicist from Connecticut who had joined the Critical Assembly Group while still working on his doctorate. On the night of August 21, 1945, just 12 days after the bombing of Nagasaki, Daghlian returned to the lab alone after dinner to continue an experiment. This was a violation of safety protocols. No one was supposed to work with the core without another scientist present. But Daghlian was eager, and the only other person in the building was a security guard sitting at a desk about 10 feet away. The experiment involved building a neutron reflector around the plutonium sphere using heavy bricks made of tungsten carbide. Each brick, when placed around the core, would bounce escaped neutrons back toward the plutonium, nudging it closer to criticality. Daghlian had stacked 5 layers of bricks and was about to place another when his monitoring instruments warned him that adding the brick would push the assembly past the critical threshold. He began to pull back, but in that instant, the brick slipped from his hand and fell directly onto the core. The effect was immediate. A burst of invisible neutron radiation flooded the room as the assembly went supercritical. Daghlian lunged forward and knocked the brick away, stopping the chain reaction, but the damage was already done. He had been standing inches from the core when it flashed. Over the next 25 days, Daghlian's body disintegrated. His right hand, the one that had been closest to the core, blistered and swelled. The skin reddened, then darkened, then began to peel away in sheets. His abdomen swelled. His nails turned blue. He suffered relentless nausea, diarrhea, and abdominal cramps as his internal organs slowly failed. His condition was meticulously documented by the medical staff. He allowed them to photograph everything. By the time he slipped into his final coma, he was emaciated and had lost most of the skin on his hands and torso. His death certificate listed the cause as severe burns of the upper extremities and trunk. He was 24 years old. What makes this story even more haunting is what happened next. Despite the fact that a young scientist had just died in agony from handling the core, experiments continued. 9 months later, on May 21st, 1946, a Canadian physicist named Louis Slotin stood in a Los Alamos laboratory in front of 7 colleagues, preparing to demonstrate the very same criticality test. Slotin was 35, confident and experienced. He had assembled the core for the Trinity test, the first nuclear detonation in history. He had performed this particular demonstration nearly a dozen times before, often wearing his trademark jeans and cowboy boots, always working with a screwdriver instead of the safety shims that protocol required. The legendary physicist Enrico Fermi had watched Slotin work and reportedly warned him that if he kept doing the experiment that way, he would be dead within a year. The experiment used 2 half-spheres of beryllium, a material that, like tungsten carbide, reflects neutrons. Slotin would lower the top half-sphere over the core, using the flat blade of a screwdriver to maintain a tiny gap between the 2 halves. The gap was crucial. If the 2 halves came together completely, the reflected neutrons would push the core past criticality, triggering a burst of radiation. The screwdriver in Slotin's hand was the only thing standing between a controlled demonstration and a lethal accident. And then the screwdriver slipped. In an instant, the top half sphere dropped, sealing around the core. The room was flooded with a blinding flash of blue light as the plutonium went supercritical. Slotin, acting on pure instinct, flipped the top half sphere off the core with his bare hand, stopping the chain reaction, but the burst of radiation had already torn through his body. He received an estimated dose that was several times the lethal threshold, concentrated heavily in his hands and upper body, which had been directly over the core. The 7 other people in the room were also exposed, though Slotin's body had partially shielded them from the worst of it. In the hours that followed, Slotin experienced intense nausea and vomiting. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors initially noted that his condition seemed to stabilize. But over the next few days, the full horror of what had happened became clear. He lost weight rapidly. His skin reddened and blistered, particularly on his left hand, the one that had been holding the screwdriver and that he had used to flip the reflector away from the core. He experienced severe abdominal pain, diarrhea, and growing mental confusion. His white blood cell count plummeted as his bone marrow, devastated by the radiation, began to shut down. A Los Alamos press release at the time described his condition as a three-dimensional sunburn, a sterile phrase that utterly failed to capture the reality of what was happening to his body. Slotin remained conscious and lucid for much of his ordeal, and those who visited him described a man who understood with terrible clarity what was happening to him. He reportedly told his doctors, calmly and without self-pity, that he knew he had received a lethal dose. 9 days after the screwdriver slipped, Louis Slotin was dead. He had perished in the same hospital room where Harry Daghlian had died 9 months earlier. The eerie parallels between their deaths are almost impossible to ignore. Both accidents happened on a Tuesday. Both happened on the 21st of the month. Both involved the same sphere of plutonium. Both resulted from a momentary lapse in an experiment designed to push that sphere to the very brink of destruction. After Slotin's death, the scientists at Los Alamos gave the plutonium sphere its final name. They called it the Demon Core, and from that point forward, all criticality experiments at the laboratory were conducted remotely, with scientists positioned a quarter of a mile away from the radioactive materials they were testing. The age of hands-on nuclear experimentation, of standing over a sphere of plutonium with nothing but a screwdriver between you and oblivion, was over. It had taken 2 deaths in less than a year to end it. Of the 7 other people who were in the room during Slotin's accident, all survived the initial exposure, but Slotin's body had only partially shielded them. Over the decades that followed, at least 4 of them died of health conditions that may have been related to the radiation they absorbed that day, including cancers and heart disease. The Demon Core itself was eventually melted down and recycled into the nation's nuclear stockpile, its atoms scattered into other weapons. But its name endures as a reminder of what happens when human confidence brushes too close to the edge of physics. Half a century later, in a quiet chemistry laboratory at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, a woman named Karen Wetterhahn was working with a substance so dangerous that a single drop, one she could not even see or feel, would steal everything from her. Karen was born in 1948 and had built a distinguished career as one of the leading experts on how toxic metals interact with biological systems. She was the first woman to become a professor in Dartmouth's chemistry department, a trailblazer who co-founded the college's Women in Science project and served as its Associate Dean of Sciences. She was a wife, a mother of 2 teenagers, and a researcher of extraordinary rigor and care. She had spent her career studying chromium and how it damages DNA, work that had direct implications for understanding cancer. She was, by every measure, a scientist who understood danger. On August 14, 1996, Karen was working in her laboratory under a fume hood, preparing a standard for nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. The substance she was using was dimethylmercury, a clear, colorless, and deceptively innocuous-looking liquid that happened to be one of the most poisonous organic compounds known to exist. She was wearing latex gloves, a lab coat, and safety goggles, all of which were standard precautions recommended by the material safety data sheets at the time. As she transferred a small amount of dimethylmercury from a sealed glass ampule into a test tube using a mechanical pipette, a drop or 2 of the liquid fell onto her gloved left hand. Karen looked at the spill. She followed protocol, She cleaned the area, removed her gloves, and washed her hands thoroughly. She had no reason to believe anything had gone wrong. The gloves were supposed to protect her. The safety guidelines said they would. But what no one knew at the time, what would only be discovered after it was far too late, was that dimethylmercury can permeate standard latex gloves in less than 15 seconds. The molecule is small and non-polar, and it passes through the rubber as though the rubber were not even there. By the time Karen felt the wetness on her skin, if she felt it at all, the compound had already been absorbed into her bloodstream. It was invisible, it was painless, and it was already killing her. For 5 months, Karen felt fine. She went about her work, taught her classes, spent time with her family. Then, in January of 1997, the symptoms appeared, subtle at first, but escalating with terrifying speed. She began stumbling, losing her balance. Her speech became slurred, her vision blurred. She had trouble hearing. The woman who was never sick was suddenly asking her husband to pick her up from work because she did not feel well enough to drive. When she finally went to the hospital, doctors at first had no idea what was wrong. After a series of tests, including spinal taps and brain scans, the diagnosis came back with shattering clarity: mercury poisoning. Her blood mercury level was 80 times the threshold of toxicity. A strand of her hair, analyzed afterward, showed a spike in mercury levels beginning exactly 17 days after the lab spill, confirming that the accident was the source. Doctors immediately began chelation therapy, a treatment that uses drugs to bind to heavy metals in the blood so they can be excreted from the body. But the mercury had been circulating in Karen's system for 5 months by this point. It had crossed the blood-brain barrier. It had destroyed neurons throughout her central nervous system. The damage was catastrophic and irreversible. While Karen was fighting for her life, her colleagues at Dartmouth launched a frantic investigation, testing her hair, her clothing, her car, her students, her family members, even her hospital room, to make sure that no one else had been exposed. Scientists around the world pored over the medical literature, searching for any precedent that might offer hope. What they found was grim. In every previous case where blood mercury levels were as high as Karen's, the patient had died. 3 weeks after her diagnosis, Karen slipped into a coma. She never woke up. On June 8, 1997, at the age of 48, Karen Wetterhahn died, leaving behind her husband, her 2 teenage children, and a scientific community that was shaken to its core. Before she lost consciousness, Karen had made one final request. She wanted her colleagues to share her story with other scientists, to warn them about the danger that had been lurking undetected in laboratories around the world. It was a final act of the same generosity and dedication to others that had defined her entire career. In the aftermath of her death, her colleagues at Dartmouth tested every type of laboratory glove they could find against dimethylmercury. The results were devastating. Nearly every glove material on the market, including the latex gloves Karen had been wearing, was permeable to the compound. The small, non-polar dimethylmercury molecule passed through standard lab gloves in seconds, as easily as water through a paper towel. Today, anyone working with dimethylmercury is required to wear specially designed laminate gloves underneath heavy-duty outer gloves resistant to abrasion and tears, a protocol that exists solely because of what happened to Karen. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration revised its guidelines. Safety data sheets around the world were updated. The use of dimethylmercury as a calibration standard has been all but abandoned, replaced by less dangerous alternatives. Dartmouth College established a graduate fellowship, an annual faculty award, and a library reading room in Karen's honor. The National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences created an award in her name for outstanding graduate students in environmental health research. Karen's death transformed laboratory safety standards around the world, but it could not bring her back. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all is that the dimethyl mercury standard she used that day confirmed what a less dangerous alternative had already shown. The mercury measurement she was trying to verify turned out to match the safer standard almost exactly. As one of her colleagues later said, the mercury chloride turned out to be dead on, but they did not know that until Karen ran the more dangerous compound. She died to confirm a number that, as it turned out, they already had. And then there is the story of Andrei Zheleznyakov, a man whose discovery was never meant to heal anyone, never meant to advance human knowledge, and never meant to see the light of day. In the shadowy laboratories of Cold War-era Soviet Union, where science served the state, and secrecy was not just expected, but enforced under threat of imprisonment, or worse, Andrei was a military researcher working at one of the most classified facilities in Russia, the State Scientific Research Institute for Organic Chemistry and Technology in Moscow. He came from a family with deep roots in the Soviet chemical weapons establishment. His father, Nikolai, had worked in chemical weapons production during World War II, overseeing the manufacture of Lewisita, hydrogen cyanide, mustard gas, and phosgene. The younger Zheleznyakov served in the Soviet Army during the 1960s before being recruited into the institute, where for years, long before any tests were ever conducted on animals, he personally analyzed nerve agents like soman and VX, handling some of the deadliest substances ever synthesized. His job was to help develop a new generation of chemical weapons, substances so lethal that they would make everything that came before them look primitive. The program was called Foliant, and its crowning achievement was a class of nerve agents known as Novichok, a Russian word meaning newcomer. These agents were designed with 4 specific goals in mind: to be more deadly than any existing nerve agent, including VX, which at the time was considered the most potent nerve agent on Earth, to penetrate NATO protective gear, to evade NATO detection equipment, and to be manufactured from common precursor chemicals that would not appear on any international watch list. The agents worked by attacking a specific enzyme in the nervous system called acetylcholinesterase, which is responsible for breaking down the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. When Novichok blocked this enzyme, acetylcholine flooded the synapses, causing the entire nervous system to go haywire. Muscles spasmed uncontrollably, the lungs filled with fluid, the heart slowed to a crawl. The victim essentially drowned in their own secretions while their body convulsed. Some variants of Novichok were estimated to be 5 to 8 times more potent than VX. A dose barely visible to the naked eye could kill a grown man in minutes. Zheleznyakov had spent years testing these agents on animals, watching as rats, dogs, and monkeys convulsed, seized, and died after exposure to microscopic quantities. He knew, in theory, exactly what these chemicals could do to a living body. But in May of 1987, theory became horrifying reality. A malfunction with the ventilation hood in his laboratory released a trace amount of Novichok 5, one of the most potent variants, into the air. Zheleznyakov breathed it in. He later described the experience in an interview with a Soviet newspaper called Novoye Vremya. He said he saw colored circles, reds and oranges, swimming before his eyes. A ringing filled his ears. He struggled to breathe. Fear gripped him, he said, as though something terrible was about to happen. He sat down in a chair and said to his colleagues, simply, "It has gotten me." An antidote was administered, and Zheleznyakov survived the initial exposure. But the damage to his body was catastrophic and permanent. Unlike other nerve agents, Novichok was specifically designed to attack not just the central nervous system, but also the peripheral nervous system, meaning the damage it caused was uniquely widespread and resistant to treatment. Over the following months and years, Zheleznyakov developed a cascade of debilitating conditions: cirrhosis of the liver, toxic hepatitis, severe nerve damage, and epilepsy. His ability to concentrate evaporated. He became withdrawn and isolated, a shadow of the man he had once been. He divorced, had no children, and spent his final years in a lonely apartment, estranged from the military establishment he had served, and resentful of what he perceived as the indifference of his superiors and the media. In an interview given shortly before his death, Zheleznyakov became one of the first people to publicly confirm the existence of the Soviet chemical weapons program and the Novichok agents it had produced, a disclosure that was both an act of conscience and an act of desperation by a man who knew his time was running out. His colleague and fellow whistleblower, Vil Mirzayanov, who would later be tried by the Russian government for revealing state secrets before eventually defecting to the United States, said that Zheleznyakov had no fear of speaking out because he knew his days were already numbered. According to Mirzayanov, Zheleznyakov provided crucial information about the program that Mirzayanov himself had been unable to disclose at the time. In 1992, less than a year after the interview was published, Andrei Zheleznyakov died of a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of approximately 50. He was not the only victim either. Another scientist at the institute, identified only as L.A. Lipasov, is also believed to have died as a result of exposure to the agents developed under the Foliant program. The newcomer that Zheleznyakov helped bring into the world outlived him by decades, and it continues to claim lives to this day. In 2018, a Novichok agent was used to poison the former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia on a park bench in Salisbury, England. A British woman named Dawn Sturgis later died after coming into contact with a discarded perfume bottle that had been used to deliver the poison, and in 2020, Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was poisoned with a Novichok agent on a flight from Siberia to Moscow. The weapon Zheleznyakov helped build outlasted the Soviet Union itself, and its shadow stretches across decades of assassination and political violence. Each of these stories sits at the same haunting intersection of brilliance and mortality, the place where human ambition and the indifference of the natural world collide. Karl Scheele tasted the poisons he discovered and paid with his kidneys, his skin, and his life at just 43. Antoine Lavoisier revolutionized chemistry, named oxygen, and dismantled centuries of misunderstanding, only to be devoured by the political fires of revolution, his head severed by the same state he had helped to modernize. Elizabeth Fleischmann peered inside the human body with invisible rays and became the first woman to die from the very technology she championed, her arm amputated, her lungs consumed by cancer, her gravestone carrying the humble epitaph she chose for herself. Marie Curie unlocked the secrets of the atom, won 2 Nobel Prizes, and helped save 1 million soldiers in wartime. And the atom slowly and silently dismantled her blood, her bones, and her vision over the course of 3 decades. Alexander Bogdanov sought immortality in transfused blood and found his death in his 12th experiment, while the student whose blood killed him walked away unharmed. Harry Daghlian and Louis Slotin tickled the tail of a sleeping nuclear dragon each one confident that skill and training would keep the beast at bay, and it awoke just long enough to destroy them both. Karen Wetterhahn, an expert on toxic metals who had dedicated her career to understanding how poisons interact with the human body, was undone by a single invisible drop of mercury that her safety equipment was supposed to stop. And Andrei Zheleznyakov built one of the deadliest weapons ever conceived and became its earliest casualty, dying alone and forgotten, while the weapon he helped create went on to be used in assassinations across continents and decades. These scientists did not die in spite of their brilliance. They died because of it, because they dared to reach into the darkness and pull back something no one had ever seen before, and the darkness reached back. Their legacies are written into the safety protocols we follow today, the protective equipment we wear, the regulations that govern laboratories and nuclear facilities and chemical weapons treaties. Every lead-lined box that stores a radioactive sample, every laminate glove that shields a chemist's hands, every remotely operated criticality test, every signed liability waiver exists because someone, somewhere, paid the ultimate price for what they discovered. These scientists gave their lives so that the rest of us could understand the world a little better. And in the quiet of the evening, as you drift off to sleep, that seems like something worth remembering. If you found these stories as fascinating and as chilling as I do, please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing to the channel. It truly helps more than you know, and it means we can keep bringing you stories like these. Until next time, sleep well.